It's my pleasure now to introduce our second academic talk of the afternoon from Villanova alumnus Dr. Rhodes Pinto. Rhodes had quite an illustrious career here at Villanova, and he's modest, but he took a number of prizes in classics and philosophy, and after leaving us at Villanova, he went on to the University of Cambridge, where he took a PhD in classics. His dissertation was entitled Pre-Socratic Treatments of Motion, and so in that very title, I think you can hear the influence of Helen and her scholarship. So it's my great pleasure to turn you over to Rhodes for a talk entitled Nature, Motion, and First Principles in Pre-Socratic Philosophy.
All right, well, thank you, Julie, and thank you, Sally, Adele, and to the rest of the department for organizing this conference and for inviting me to speak. I really can't tell you how much it means to be given the opportunity to give a paper today in Helen's honor. Now, I don't know whether this was intentional on your part, but you happened to schedule this conference on Plato's birthday. At least as it was celebrating the Florentine Renaissance tradition. So I think Helen, particularly as the arch-Aristotelian, would have been particularly amused at the scheduling of this event on Plato's birthday. Now, one need only look at Helen's immense CV to see what an impact she's had upon the field. And I'll just tell you one quick story here, which is that she was once telling me about the foolishness of journal reviews, blind journal reviews. And she once submitted an article and she got it back rejected. And why was the article rejected? Well, the main reason was because she didn't cite the scholar Helen Lang enough, who was so important on the topic. Of course, she wrote back to the editor to say, "But I'm Helen Lang." But unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears. Such was the integrity of the journal, this blind review process. But what one cannot tell from Helen's CV is what an impact she's had upon her students, of whom I was most fortunate to be one. It's hard for me to state in words just how much of an impact Helen had upon me personally. So great is it. In fact, I think it's the greatest of anyone outside of my immediate family. Whatever I say will inevitably fall short of conveying just how much Helen meant to me as a teacher, as a fellow scholar, and as a friend. So apologies for sort of looking at notes here. There's just so many good things about Helen. I'm afraid I'm going to forget some of them. I had the pleasure of having Helen for a number of undergraduate courses, as well as graduate seminars and several independent studies. She was just an absolutely amazing teacher. One feature of her teaching, and actually of her scholarship as well, that stands out to me was the clarity of explanation that she gave. She always just had such clear, crisp, and precise explanations, particularly of parts of Aristotle that are just notoriously convoluted and tricky, like Aristotle on time. And she was also such an engaging teacher as well for students. Whoever went to one of her classes could hardly forget her routine pauses, where she would ask for questions, comments, objections, heckles. And depending on the mood, sometimes she would also add catcalls as the last one to that, which always elicited that chuckle from the students as well. And she also had, as several people have already mentioned, just such a genuine passion for the material that came through in everything she taught. Actually, I remember one time a couple of years ago, I was having lunch with Helen, and I'd said, I just recently had a really good working day and made a lot of progress, and I really in the zone. Said, I was so excited by the discoveries. I couldn't even sleep that night. I'm so glad you said that, because that's exactly my experience as well. That I get so excited about my findings that I can't even sleep. So that should really tell you how Helen felt about her work and about Aristotle. Now, I came into my first class with her, which was History of Ancients, with no intention of becoming an ancient philosopher. The same cannot be said for when I left it, and as you can see, here I am today. Needless to say, her discussions of ancient physics, and particularly motion, really got me very excited, and that's the reason that I've ended up myself working not just in ancient philosophy, but in ancient physics most particularly. And I think it's in large part due to the fact that she was able to so masterfully reveal its inherent excitement and interest. She never wanted to be retrospective, to blame and praise it with how it fits into our modern scientific or our modern philosophical understandings, but rather she tried to get us all to understand and appreciate what the philosophers themselves were doing, which is one of the many ways in which Helen has influenced my own approach. Now, apart from the purely instructional side of things, Helen also showed tremendous personal care for me in my future. This goes back to some of what Adele was saying about Helen's mentoring. For instance, there's a time when I really could use a couple of independent studies, and Helen was all too glad to give me independent studies, to which she devoted just a tremendous amount of her time and preparation as well. And she was just ever so generous in giving me advice. I know when I was applying for PhD programs, she insisted on reading over all of my letters and so forth, and offering the many infamous Helen corrections and improvements upon them. So there's no question in my mind, without her help and without her support, I wouldn't have ended up at Cambridge. But her care for me didn't end when I went to Cambridge, not in the least, though our relationship changed somewhat. It transitioned to one of friends and fellow scholars, which was a great joy and an honor for me, even so I felt. She would write me quite frequently just to see how I was doing. She always wanted to hear the latest news and brag about it to Julie, as she would say she was going to do. So enthusiastic was she always about it. And of course she wanted to read my latest work, which I always felt was such an honor. And whenever I was back in town, of course we had to go out to lunch and talk philosophy and talk about our lives, and she'd say how much she was looking forward to the visit to the grandchildren and so forth. In fact, in one of those lunches, I was telling her I was having this problem, with this portion of my dissertation. And of course, she offered to read it, and her insight into that was, I think, really what resolved which was the biggest problem of my dissertation. Even afterwards, she wanted to read my entire job dossier. In fact, the last email I ever received from her, which was after her illness, was saying how she would help in every way that she could, and to just let me know what she could do. All of this is well beyond the call of duty for a professor one had as an undergraduate, but such was how Helen truly cared about her students. It's rare to find someone of such high caliber, both as a scholar and a teacher, but what's even rarer, and what made Helen so special, was that she was also a genuinely kind, caring person. And I think I'm just one of really everyone in this room who is just so glad to have had her in our lives. Now, I think that one of Helen's favorite lines in all of philosophy might have been the start of Aristotle's Physics too. Of things that are, some are by nature, some are by other causes. And nature, as Helen would tell us, is a source of being moved and being at rest. Another one of her favorite lines, also from the Physics, that nature is everywhere a cause of order. Aristotle is very careful to explain motion, including giving account of the first principle of motion, which he argues is an unmoved mover, within his discussions of nature and the elements in his physics. And indeed, he does so in such a way as to account for the order which the world features. Instead of looking at and forward from Aristotle's physics, like Helen, perhaps because I still can't quite face her tremendous legacy in that area, I'm looking backwards to the pre-Socratics in my present research. Now, these are the philosophers, about 13 major figures, active in the Greek-speaking world before Socrates. So we're at the very start of the Western philosophical tradition, and their survival is rather tenuous. We just have generally small fragments plus secondhand or even worse reports by other later ancient authors, which are often unreliable, and that makes it a great challenge to reconstruct their documents and arguments. So today I want to give you something of a tour through the pre-Socratics, some of their approaches to motion. It's not going to be comprehensive by any means, just a few of the highlights from some of my present research. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through 4 of the pre-Socratics, ranging from the very first to the very last, and we'll look at in that 2 material monists and 2 material pluralists. While there's a decent body of secondary literature on motion in Plato and Aristotle, thanks in no trivial part to Helen, I think, there's almost nothing on motion in the pre-Socratics, with perhaps the exception of Zeno. It hasn't been appreciated how they're making efforts, and as I hope to demonstrate in this talk, philosophically interesting and valuable efforts to account for motion as part of their philosophical programs. So I want to start with a very brief look at the first temporally of the pre-Socratics, Thales. So he dates to the early 6th century BC. I think it's helpful if we have some sense of where things stand with motion at the outset of philosophical investigation. Unfortunately, I just don't have time to give it a full treatment, but a full treatment can be found in an article I have out at the moment anyway, so hopefully you'll just permit me to summarize my findings on him. Thales was a material monist, which means that he tried to reduce all things to some one stuff. Thales, that stuff was water. I think the balance of the evidence strongly suggests that Thales held that all things have come to be from water and will revert back into water at some point. He regards water as divine and as having soul. He does not, as scholars widely suppose, maintain a panpsychist or an animist doctrine. In other words, there's a soul in everything. The evidence that we have of his explanations of magnetism and of earthquakes instead suggests that he understood soul to be the property of being able to initiate motion for those bodies which do initiate some motion. The type of body determines what sorts of bodies that soul can move and under what sorts of conditions it can move. Living things die when the body is changed enough to eliminate this property. When water, which has this property of initiating motion, what it changes into may or may not have this property, depending on what type of thing it is. There's not any requirement that the new thing possess this property that water had any more than it possessed water's property of transparency. So Thales' account of motion, so far as we can tell from the very limited evidence, and it is really limited indeed, is closely connected with his monadic principle, water. As all things come to be from water, the property of initiating motion which water has can be variably transmitted to them. So then I want to move on to another pre-Socratic, Anaxagoras, and so this is a pretty decent skip. We're now a little more than a century after Thales, and we're into really the later period of pre-Socratic philosophy. This is early to mid-5th century now. And I want to start with his physical theory. Anaxagoras is a material pluralist who postulates that there are a number of basic stuffs. Exactly how many is hotly contested, to say the least, in the literature. Candidates for these stuffs, let's call them ingredients, as they're often called, based on the surviving fragments and testimonia, include hot, cold, moist, dry, bright, dark, earth, water, air, ether, seeds, hair, flesh, bone, gold. I could give you even more than those. Luckily, we for our purposes today, we don't actually need to worry about just which ones are his basic ingredients. What is important is that Anaxagoras claims repeatedly, we have this in multiple fragments, that everything has a share of everything, of all the ingredients that there are. Everything, that is, with the exception of mind, nous, which I'll talk more about a little later. He also holds that phenomenal objects, like this wood, at least if it was wood, are compounds or mixtures of the ingredients. Indeed, he claims that what makes this particular mixture of ingredients is its particular comparative concentration of the ingredients. He says in one fragment that coming to be is actually a mixture, and perishing is actually separating apart. So as there's mixture into or separation apart of the ingredients, the comparative concentrations are altered, bringing about what later thinkers will call substantial change. It also seems reasonable to suppose that change in comparative concentration of the ingredients also accounts for what later thinkers will call qualitative change. That would feature a shift to comparative concentration that's weaker. For instance, as the hot comes into this water I have in here, increasing its comparative concentration over cold, the water undergoes qualitative change from cold to hot. Now, to get this change in concentration, there must be more or less of some ingredients in this locality now than there was before. Accordingly, some of them have moved to or from this locality. So what we might think of as qualitative or substantial changes are actually, for Anaxagoras, local motions that occur on the scale of, or perhaps on the ontological level of, the basic ingredient stuffs, locomotions which alter the comparative concentration of those ingredients. Well, I think that's very interesting. What Anaxagoras is doing here is he's reducing all change to motion. But wait, there's more, as the infomercial line goes. And here's where I think the cleverness of Anaxagoras' position can come into view in how Anaxagoras accounts for motion. Now, as I argue at length in an article I have forthcoming, so just fair warning that this is not necessarily something that everyone will agree with me on, Anaxagoras subscribes to a thesis that the encounter of considerably different things is inherently productive of motion. The sort of motion that comes about from this encounter depends on the character of the things and of their encounter. Evidence for this comes from his explanation of meteorological phenomenon, as well as from his doctrine of perception, which depends on unlike by unlike causation, which is a real rarity for the pre-Socratics. Aristotle tells us that Anaxagoras is the only one of the pre-Socratics to go for unlike by unlike causation. But perhaps the best evidence that difference produces motion, and I think the most important case, is the production of the cosmic vortex that forms our world. According to several fragments of Anaxagoras, at the very outset, all of the ingredients were together in an entirely undifferentiated mixture. There are no localized predominances. It's an even mixture, as it were. Mind causes a vortex, a rotational motion, in this undifferentiated mixture that affects a degree of separation. We can't have full separation ever, but it affects a degree of separation on the ingredients, and that forms our world. So I'll read you a portion of a very important fragment 12 that talks about this. Mind also ruled the entire revolution, so that the revolution began straight away. At first it began to revolve from a small area, and now it revolves more, and it will revolve even more. Mind comprehended all of the things that are being mixed together, separated off, and separated apart. Whatever sorts of things were going to be, whatever was but is no longer, whatever now is, and whatever will be, all of these mind organized. Mind also organized the revolution, which now revolves the things that are being separated off: stars, sun, moon, air, and ether. This revolution brought about separating off. The dense separates off from the rare, the hot from the cold, the bright from the dark, and the dry from the moist. But there are many shares of many things, and nothing is entirely separated off or apart from another except mind. So why does Anaxagoras invoke mind for the production of this cosmic vortex? And how does it bring about this motion? I think it's hardly accidental that Anaxagoras takes care to emphasize that mind and the mixture are very different things. Let me read you another portion of this fragment 12. While everything else has a share of everything, mind is unlimited and self-ruling, and has been mixed with no thing, but is alone itself by itself. For if it were not by itself, but had been mixed with something else, it would have a share of all things. For a share of everything is present in everything, just as what I said in what came before, and what is mixed with it would hamper it, so that it would rule no thing, as indeed it does, being alone by itself. Since everything besides mind, is a mixture that has a share of everything, there's not in the mixture itself the degree of difference required for it to produce on its own a vast cosmic rotation that separates it out, and certainly not in that initial undifferentiated state. Only mind has a permanent difference, one of kind, to everything else, and that's why Anaxagoras invokes mind for producing the cosmic vortex. Mind is coextensive with the mixture. We have some fragments that strongly support this, and hence mind is always together with the mixture, such that the difference between it and the mixture brings about, powers this great motion. And this would account for why Anaxagoras states, as we heard just a moment ago, that what is mixed with mind would hamper it, so that it would rule no thing. If mind featured a mixture of ingredients, mind would not have the difference to the mixture of those ingredients requisite for causing the vortex motion. Still, Anaxagoras ascribes the responsibility for causing the vortex to mind. He says that mind rules the vortex. He doesn't ascribe it to the mixture, or to both equally. And it's here that the nature of mind as mental agent comes into play, I think. For it's surely important that Anaxagoras says that this pure entity is mind. In fragment 12, as we heard, Anaxagoras claims that mind possesses complete discernment about everything, that mind comprehended all the things that are being mixed together, separated off, and separated apart. It's the discernment that mind possesses and exercises, in virtue of being a mind, that I suggest allows for mind to rule the revolution. Mind recognizes that rotation will bring about an ordering separation of the world, and its intention to bring this about is what produces the specifically rotational motion. Some sort of motion or activity is going to be produced when mind and the mixture, these two very different things encounter each other, which they're always doing since they're coextensive, but it's mind's intention that serves to bring about rotational motion instead of some other sorts of motion, such as our minds, other animals, and plants' minds do bring about for him. In modern terms, the difference between mind and the mixture can be thought of as powering the motion like a battery or an engine. Just a particular way in which mind is disposed, either its intention, its affect, what, if you'll forgive me for speaking of this way, we could call mind's state of mind, that prescribes the sort of motion to take place. Now, that's a very intriguing manner of explanation, I think. Mind has often in Western thought been strongly opposed to body and in a dualism, with mind able to act upon body despite their difference. Anaxagoras would be an early party to this tradition, strongly differentiating mind from everything else. In Anaxagoras' case, though, it's the very difference in kind between mind and body that allows them to interact, rather than this difference presenting a problem for their capacity to interact. And it leaves open the space of teleology, because mind can direct motion on the basis of its state. For Anaxagoras, then, there's no first principle of motion as such. Rather, he's using difference that's built into his physical system as a causal principle, but also in such a way that allows mind to have some control. So now I want to move on to the atomists, Leucippus and Democritus. The evidence is such that we can't really separate the two of them very easily, so typically just treat them as one unit. Democritus was active in the mid to the late 5th century, and Leucippus presumably a little earlier, so roughly contemporary with Anaxagoras. Now, they're also material pluralists. They claim that indivisible bodies, different shapes and sizes, atoms are basic, as well as void, of course. Atoms have always existed and will exist. All the phenomenal objects of the world are certain groups of atoms fitted together in certain ways. As Helen would say when describing this, the atoms have, the atom shapes have little hooker-dookers. That was her technical term for this. Hooker-dookers that they would hook onto and connect with each other to do. I'm not quite sure what Greek that represents, but it was very effective nonetheless. Qualities such as hot and wet too are a function of the shape and grouping of atoms. All change amounts to a regrouping or reordering of the atoms, which stems from changing place, from local motion of the atoms. So, like Anaxagoras, for the atomists, all change is being reduced to motion. What are the motion of atoms, then? Let me read you a few pieces of evidence. This first comes from Cicero. What Democritus calls atoms, that is to say bodies which are indivisible on account of their solidity, are so moved in an infinite void that they coalesce from their collisions with each other. From these collisions, everything which we see is produced. And the motion of the atoms is understood to come about from no beginning, but rather from an eternity of time. Simplicius, one of the commentators on Aristotle, says, Democritus, who claims that atoms are by nature unmoved, says that they are moved by impact. Finally, another report, it's quite a long report, but it includes the mention that the motion of the atoms is unplanned and random. So the simple answer is that atoms have always been in motion, indeed in a random one, such that they end up colliding with each other. I suspect that Simplicius is reliable when he reports that atoms are by nature unmoved. It's not that they're inherently motive, that there's some sort of self-mover having some sort of internal source or cause that moves them. Rather, they're moved by impact when they collide, and this has simply always been going on. There's always been prior impact and impact before that. Now, that's a very interesting idea, actually, that the motion, that the change of impacts has just always been occurring. It's an interesting contrast to Plato and Aristotle's assumption that there cannot be an infinite causal regress, particularly emphasizes for motion, and that assumption leads back to their first principles of motion, that you can't have that chain go back forever. You have to have some first cause, some first principle of motion to start the chain. Indeed, Aristotle in the Physics directly attacks Democritus' theory. He says it's not a sufficient count to simply say that things were always the way that they are. But the assumption that the infinite causal regress is impossible, it's not one that should be so hastily granted. Plato and Aristotle don't actually argue for it, at least as concerns motion. So I think it's good of the atomists to give us the other side of it. Let me also say something brief about the creation of this universe according to the atomists, which will reveal how they produce order via motion. The universe is formed by a whole bunch of atoms that undergo vortex motion. And now, quote from one of our later sources, vortex motion in which, as they strike each other and revolve in all kinds of ways, the like separates off to the like. So this vortex motion affects a stratification, similar atoms grouped to similar atoms, and it also helps sort of hook them together in such a way that forms this world that we have. What's noteworthy here to me is the invocation of a like-to-like principle. We actually have a fragment of Democritus which strongly indicates that he pushed the like-to-like causal principle, and I'll read this to you. For animals congregate with the same kind of animals, for instance, doves with doves, cranes with cranes, and likewise for the other irrational animals. And so it is too with inanimate things, just as can be seen with sifted grains and with pebbles on the seashore. For with the separative whirl of the sea, lentils are placed with lentils, grains of barley with grains of barley, grains of wheat with grains of wheat. And with the motion of waves, oblong pebbles are pushed to the same place as oblong pebbles, and round pebbles to round pebbles, as if likeness between things had a certain ability to bring them together. So there's an important principle here that's doing some major work for them, a like-to-like attraction by motion, by rotation, and perhaps other certain kinds as well. That provides a source of order. Now, of course, this is not teleological. There's no intent. There's no aim here. Now, of course, also in Anaxagoras, we saw this very same like-to-like principle being used in his cosmogony, right? Because there also had a vortex motion that affected a degree of separation of parts of the ingredients, where again, like ones are concentrated with like ones. So in both Anaxagoras and the atomists, acceptance of this like-to-like principle does major work in getting an ordered world by motion. The key difference, of course, is that in Anaxagoras, that vortex is employed by its, the mind based on its intent, so it can retain a teleological dimension that's not present in the atomist. What we don't get in either philosopher, at least so far as I can tell, is an account of why such motion, why rotational motion, should affect like-to-like attraction, though the fragment of Democritus that I just read you might suggest that he presented it as a sort of fundamental principle, and perhaps it's one that's applicable even beyond motion. Perhaps that's the appeal to animals that we heard. So for the atomists, we don't have a first principle of motion. We have quite the reverse move. We do have a sort of cause of motion for them, which is to say impact. It's just the case that it's always been going back forever. And their acceptance of the principle of like to like attraction allows them to account for the ordered universe. I think that's an impressive explanatory attempt and an interesting alternative to Plato and Aristotle. Still, so influential are Plato and Aristotle that Epicurus, who is of course a subscriber to the atomic theory of Leucippus and Democritus, he's about 40 years younger than Aristotle, accordingly modifies their atomic theory. Now, of course, his famous modification is the swerve, but that's actually not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is another modification. It's one we can see in this report of Cicero, which I'll read you. Cicero's talking about the motive force of atoms. According to Democritus, atoms have an incitement called impact. That's what we heard before. But according to you, Epicurus, heaviness and weight. This corresponds with other reports that say Epicurus had weight as one of the properties of atoms. It's not one of the properties that's given in Leucippus and Democritus. What I think this shows is that in light of Plato and Aristotle's accounts of the first principle of motion, it was no longer considered a tolerable causal account to say, well, the motion, the series of impacts, has always been going on. So Epicurus provides a sort of internal cause for the motion of atoms, which is to say their weight. Whether he really needed to or not is another question. But I'll leave that open, and I'll move on now to Diogenes of Apollonia, who's about the last temporally of the pre-Socratic philosophers. So he's roughly contemporary with Democritus. So we're now about 150 years after Thales, and we're in the generation before Socrates. Monism, at least material monism, had by this time really fallen out of favor for material pluralisms, like we saw in Anaxagoras and the atomists. It's really just the early pre-Socratics, like Thales, that go for material monisms, but Diogenes revives it, making air his principle of all things. Now, this is most scholars rate his philosophy very lowly. One major scholar describes his thoughts as, and I'll quote this since it's so good, like the last meaningless twitchings of a broken habit, uncoordinated repetitions of a pattern of past meaning. And you can get more good insults if you just try to read the literature on Diogenes. It's my view instead that Diogenes' philosophy is first rate among the pre-Socratics, as the original and I think rather compelling way in which his monism is used to account for motion helps to reveal. According to several fragments of Diogenes, all things are actually forms of air, which is eternal, divine, and intelligence. He says in the fragment that air has, and I'll quote part of this fragment for you, many modes, hotter and colder, drier and moister, more stationary and having swifter motion, and many other differences are present in it, unlimited in variety. So what I think Diogenes is saying here is that air has certain differentiatable characteristics, what approximates later notions of properties. I don't want to get too much into the finer details of some monisms, as there are some significant interpretive challenges. For our purposes, we can be satisfied and I think safe in saying that on the basis of what we heard in this fragment, air has at least three of what I would term axes of differentiation: heat, moisture, and motion. Each of these axes offers a range of possible discrete values that this particular bit of air can hold. So, for instance, all air has temperature. It can be cold, it can be cool, it can be lukewarm, it can be warm, it can be hot, and each particular bit of air is going to be somewhere on that spectrum. And what I want to stress here is the inclusion of motion. We heard that with more stationary and having swifter motion as one of these axes of differentiation on apparent equal footing with such qualitative differences as of heat and temperature, whereby motion is something possessed by all things to a greater or lesser degree. For Diogenes, then, accounting for motion is part and parcel with accounting for change and accounting for plurality. He does not, as Anaxagoras and the atomists, reduce all change to motion. Rather, he can be regarded as doing the reverse, reducing motion to a change. Motion is one of the properties of air that's subject to a range of changing values, just like heat or moisture. There's a certain brilliance and indeed I think elegance to how Diogenes is treating motion as a characteristic which all things possess in varying degrees. That guarantees the ability of anything both to cause motion and to undergo motion. Now strictly speaking, of course, there's no causation of motion in his understanding, at least not in the conventional sense of motion where there's none prior. So what you have instead for him is cause in the change of degree of motion. So there's no need, there's no place for a first principle motion in Diogenes' system. What's needed to account for motion comes built into the material principle. We do not, as in the atomists, need to accept infinite causal regress of motion either. That's a distinct advantage to making motion inherent property, possessed in varying degrees of what is. I think it's something of a complete alternative to causal chains of movers that either terminate with some first mover, like Plato and Aristotle, or regress back infinitely, like the atomists. Now, while Diogenes did not spell it out in the extant fragments, it's reasonable to suppose that the interaction of one thing with another thing which has a different precise value along the same axis, or axes, would produce a change in these values for one or for both things. So you put water, which has a particular heat value, in a vessel which has a different particular heat value, and the appropriate heating or cooling takes place. The difference in values is what produces the change. Presumably motion would follow this manner of explanation. When two objects with different degrees of motion come into contact or somehow otherwise interact, this produces a change in the equal degree of motion for one or for both objects. So thus the more swiftly moving object moves the more stationary object, or the more stationary object virtually stops the more swiftly moving object. So difference is responsible for motion, change in motion, which should remind us of how we saw Anaxagoras accounting for motion by a difference between things. But for Anaxagoras, the difference was between stuffs and the compounds of these stuffs, whereas for Anaxagoras, it's between the properties of the same stuff, air. And it's not just difference on the motion axis, I should say, that I think can produce motion for Diogenes. There's also evidence that he invoked differences in moisture, one of the other axes that we saw, to account for the production of certain motions. So Seneca gives us Diogenes' explanation for why the earth hasn't dried up despite all the heat from the sun. I'll read this to you. When the earth has become dried up, it draws more moisture to it. Just as the oil in a lamp flows to where it is burned up, so too water inclines itself to where the force of the heat and the burning earth summon. So here a difference in moisture produces motion, more technically a change in degree of motion. We also have a report on Diogenes' explanation of magnetism. According to it, Diogenes thought that metals and rocks both emit and absorb moisture. the magnet absorbs more moisture than it emits, the iron emits more moisture than it absorbs. So if one thing emitting more than absorbs and the other absorbing more than emits, get them close enough, and this difference draws the former to the latter, draws the iron towards the magnet. And while I don't want to get into it too much today, I also think that a fragment suggests that for Diogenes, soul, which is what moves living things, is a function of a difference in heat between the warmer air that's internal to the organism and the colder air outside. Now this all leads me to my second point about how Diogenes explains motion, and that's that he's evidently invoking the sort of principle of equality, that nature strives towards an equal balance without such differences. That's how the water is moving to the dried up earth. It's this equalizing inclination present when there are differences between things in regards to one of the axes that causes these differences to be productive of motion or change. Now, we needn't be quite so disappointed when we ask why is there this equalizing inclination, as we were when we were asking why is there this principle of like-to-like causation, or like-to-like attraction in Anaxagoras and the atomists. For I think it's a strong possibility that the equalizing inclination for Diogenes is an intelligent operation of air ordering the world. For Diogenes, it's quite clear in one of the fragments, fragment 3, that air possesses intellection, on account of which the world is ordered in the best possible way. This equalization of differences on the axes could be one of the major instances of how air orders the world with its intelligence. Now, I think some of the specific language of the fragment actually supports that. Intelligence, Diogenes would suppose, is required to equalize things, to recognize what would amount to an equal distribution. So Diogenes offers a monadic principle which can both provide for and receive the variety of motion and change evidenced in the world by means of its inherent variation, both in motion itself and in other properties like heat and moisture. His is actually a sophisticated monism, producing an original and I think rather elegant and compelling way of accounting for motion as one of the properties possessed in varying degrees by the one stuff that comprises everything. So just to wrap things up, in the pre-Socratics I've gone through with you, we've seen how their explanations of motion closely connected to their material principle or principles and how our ordered universe has come about. And the result is a variety of, I think, impressive and surprisingly sophisticated ways of accounting for motion and change, as well as for our orderly universe. A major aim of Helen's work was to show the philosophical value and interest in Aristotle's physics and how well cohered both itself and within its broader philosophical system. Helen's work has inspired me, and she herself has directly supported me in trying to do the same for the pre-Socratics, and I hope that my talk today has given some indication of its success. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rhodes. At the end of this lovely afternoon of intellectual feasting and personal reflections, we thought we'd close with some tributes from friends. And I received a couple of notes, some from former students and colleagues, and I just thought I would take a moment and read those to you. One of the last conferences Helen attended was in Paris. It was a conference on the theme of embodiment, put together by a philosopher called Justin Smith. Justin had come to Villanova to visit. He gave a talk on race and early modern philosophy. Helen attended, and they hit it off famously. And he was very excited to meet her because she was a sort of founding mother of studies on matter and body. And so he was very, very pleased to include her work in a book that's coming out. It's actually called Embodiment from Oxford UP. And he wrote to tell me that the volume will be dedicated to her memory. And so I wanted to pass that along to everybody. He sends his greetings to the assembled philosophers, friends, and family. I also wanted to pass on good wishes from Father Jim McCartney, who is himself recovering from surgery and so couldn't make it here this afternoon, but wanted me to send his good wishes. And I received a lovely note from one of our PhD students, John Garner, who finished up just a couple of years ago and is now teaching at West Georgia University. This is what John wrote. Helen's care and generosity as a teacher and mentor stand out to me above all. To take a course with Helen was, in my experience, to be drawn out of one's fantasies. Thanks to her, we could see the world as the ancients saw it. She made the language of the ancients live, made present their world to us. She also challenged us immensely, especially in our writing, out of what strikes me as a very rare honesty, isn't that nice, and generous desire to make us better. In my case, she changed my life when she pushed me to gain real control of the text. Only then could I be receptive to the thought. Her voice in this respect will always be with me. Finally, as a mentor and friend, Helen was doubly generous in offering her graduate students not only her wisdom, her free time, and even her home, but also her authentic care, which requires so much more. Helen was a giver. I'm indebted to her perhaps above all for this. She helped me understand how to learn. It's a really beautiful, beautiful tribute from John. I'd like at this point to invite Helen's great friend Alvia Branch to share some reflections.
Hello, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to address Helen's friends and colleagues. I'm Alvia Branch, and Helen and I were the closest of friends, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to know her and her family. Helen once said of another friend of hers that this friend had a genius for friendship, and that was exactly true of Helen herself. I met Helen in 2004. I had just moved into 216 Pine Street in Philadelphia, and Helen had moved into 218 Pine Street. And so we were next door neighbors, and we immediately we got along like a house on fire. We quickly exchanged our life stories and found that there was so much similar in spite of so much that was different. And so that was the beginning of this decade-long friendship. And some of the things that we found out that were similar was our difficult childhoods from different perspectives. We both went through difficult childhoods, but we nevertheless found the same ticket out. Education was our ticket out. And Helen, as you know, became a PhD in philosophy, and I a PhD in psychology. But I just wanted to share with you some of the additional elements of our friendship, the things that we enjoyed, kind of the currency of this friendship. I would say a wide and varied friendship. Reading was a strong possibility of it. I heard someone mention A Suitable Boy, and one of the first gifts that Helen ever gave me was this volume of Vikram Seth, A Suitable Boy. And I read it, we discussed it, we both enjoyed it, and from that point on, our friendship was cemented. But the other thing was, our choices in periodicals. Helen read the New York Times, from time to time she'd say from cover to cover, and the New Yorker. And kind of independently, we both subscribed to those two periodicals. So conversation just freely flowed as a result of that. It was always, did you read this article? Did you read this obituary? Helen was like kind of a constant consumer of those. That's how she read the, so that was an element in our conversation. But, I passed the Vikram Seth test. It was like 1,345 pages cover to cover, and one of the longest novels written in English at the time. He may have surpassed himself. But some other things that we did that maybe you know, maybe you don't. One was sports. Helen was she was a big sports buff. So we watched the Super Bowl every year. And if there wasn't a team that we supported or turned out to be interested in, it was just conversation, and we'd look up at the game from time to time. But so the Super Bowl football was part of it. Also, she was very interested in Villanova basketball. So whenever Villanova got to the Elite Eight or the Final Four, we were there. And this past, the 2015-16 sports year, when Villanova actually won the national championship, I think Helen by that time was ill, but aware enough that Villanova won, and and she was so pleased. The other thing is that we were both keenly interested in politics, and in particular in national politics, so that in 2008, especially during the primary season, we were on opposite sides. She was a big Hillary supporter. I was a big Obama supporter. But once the general election came about, we were in sync with each other. Helen and I made calls. We pledged money, and when it was over and Obama had won, I had an election night party that Helen attended and enjoyed, and we sat down in my house and watched the inaugural ceremony from beginning to end. And the same was true in 2012. We both did phone banking and so forth. So it's with some sadness that Helen is not here for the election tomorrow, and hopefully the outcome that she wanted to see so greatly. In addition to those elements that I have mentioned, I wanted to just kind of talk about the way we interwove our family and friends. I got to know Helen's family very early, her daughters, her sons-in-law, and the 6 grandchildren. And like people have mentioned thus far, she was very generous with her hospitality. So I can't count the number of times that Helen held big family dinners and I was in attendance. It was just so routine. It's like, where's Alvy, a Gaby would say. So that was good. Now my family was different. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and by the time that I met Helen, my only living biological relative was my sister. And Helen, of course, did get to meet her. She met her first in a circumstance where I was in intensive care for pneumonia. And my sister came. All of my large supportive surrogate family was there. And there was Helen when the ether cleared, and she was just a mainstay to me during that period. And so, I mentioned the surrogate family. Helen got to know them in the same way that I got to know Helen's family. So one of my friends, Gwen DeVoe Way, Helen was as close to her as I was virtually. And when Gwen's husband died, Helen made a gift to our church, the Mother Bethel AME Church, in his memory. And so there are lots of stories like that. I usually hosted this group of friends on Thanksgiving, and Helen was there again. Helen was there for that gathering many, many, many times, and it was like her own event. You know, she would greet guests at the door, and she was just like kind of completely dialed into that. One of the celebrations that we had, I wanted just to mention, and that was like for my birthday. Helen and I were born the same year, kind of 3 months apart, and we always did something for each other's birthday. And so on this last birthday of mine, she had planned dinner, and for us, Helen, me, my friend Gwen, her friend Gwen, and also our friend Shani Rabada, who is here today. But then that's when her illness intervened. And so we thought that it would never come to fruition. But as it turned out, she enjoyed a period of recovery. And so we ended up in May having that celebration. And it was, you know, it was a great celebration. Helen was in such good shape and in such good spirits that she critiqued the opera. She enjoyed the dinner. She didn't want over solicitousness on any of our parts, and it was one of the best celebrations that we had ever had. And so when her final illness happened, I was lucky enough again to see her, visit her 2 additional times before she passed. And I would just like to say she was one of the closest and best friends I ever had, and I'm so grateful for having had that experience.
Louis, can I invite you to say a few words?
Sure, unless there are other folks that want to jump in. But if not, yeah.
Please.
I'll leave you now. So, I guess I was basically her last student before she left Villanova and passed away. A few years back, I was pretty convinced that I was going to write a dissertation on Spinoza, and then I took a class with Helen. Sorry, Julie. I took the Body and Soul and Plato and Aristotle course, and then immediately followed that up with an independent study on medieval philosophy. And I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I ended up taking a course with her where I was the only student, and I'm very grateful no one else signed up for that, because it was possibly the best academic year, the best courses I ever had. Just sharing that with her, being there one-to-one with her, reading the text in Greek, thinking through the arguments with her, just being there so close to that experience of enthusiasm and joy that she found in philosophy, in Aristotle, and teaching, and I became completely absorbed in that, and I feel like that became my own in many ways. I still think back. It's even opening Aristotle today kind of brings back these memories right away. Sometimes just looking even in secondary, you see lines and you immediately remember Helen, and it's a little sad, but it's also such joy because she was such a great friend and such a great mentor, and just I'm so thankful because you really reinvigorated a love for thinking and for philosophy in me that I'm never going to forget. Thank you.
Helen had a passage from Aristotle for every occasion.
Oh, yeah.
And I didn't know that today was a traditional date for Plato's birthday, but it did bring to mind a passage from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It's a famous one where Aristotle says the Platonists are our friends, but the truth is a greater one. Which is a passage Helen and I discussed on many occasions. She was a great lover of Plato, but in the end her allegiances were elsewhere. And she had a marvelous sense of doing philosophy not just as an investigation of texts and a project and trying to understand what the ancients thought, but as a process of dealing with real issues and real problems and actually searching for truth. And she saw the classroom as the main place for that. She loved the library. This was one of her favorite spots at Villanova. And she also used to hang out at the library at Penn. She would take the bus across Center City from her house and kind of hole up with her favorite books. But she really loved the classroom. And so it always struck me as fitting that she loved Aristotle, so many of whose works we know through indeed the marvelous notes of students who were in the room. And the passage that to me really stands out, and the Aristotle passage that stands out in connection with Helen, comes fairly early in the metaphysics. Aristotle, as many of you know, likes to review the positions of his predecessors. And often the review is fairly critical. And it's not always the most charitable, but it's pretty good. And in this particular passage early on in the metaphysics, he says that we should be grateful to our predecessors, even when they were wrong, for handing down the habit of thinking. That we owe them a debt of gratitude for handing down those habits. And it's been just a marvelous afternoon of listening to so many people talk about how Helen handed down the love of learning and handed down the gift of friendship and a gift for living well. Helen, as everyone here knows, lukewarm was not one of Helen's temperatures. She lived very intensely, very vividly, very passionately, and was always just absolutely herself. And she took enormous pleasure in family and friends and intellectual work. She loved Philadelphia. She loved to go out and hear music. She loved to go out to eat. She loved art. She loved literature. Really was a life taken up as much as possible with great pleasures, and thinking was surely one of those great pleasures for her. So thank you all for spending this afternoon with us, remembering our friend, our mentor, our colleague. Those of you who had the Lang treatment can pass it on. We're all better for it. And we in the philosophy department have a gift for Jess and Ari, and so I'm going to ask Sally Schultz to come back. And Sally is also the best person to give us some directions to how to get over to the reception at the Dumbbell Mansion, to which everybody is most warmly invited.
Yes, we use university caterers, so we can't really promise perhaps a gourmet meal, but we did our very best to do that because we know that Helen was a great lover of food. And there will be wine as well. So. For Jess and Ari, we and Louis, where did Louis go there? Louis gets a lot of credit for this one as well. We gathered together her articles, and we've bound them for you. So we hope that her words will spring from the page, and that you'll share them with your children. And this is 35 of the 38 articles. The last 3 we didn't quite make in, but we hope you'll enjoy. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for coming. And the reception is at Dundale Hall, or the Colte at Dundale, or Dundale, something along those lines. It's a lovely mansion on campus. So we hope you'll join us. To get there, you can hitch a ride with some of us with cars, or if you are up for a walk, take the underpass to South Campus and walk down the center of the apartments.
West.
Oh, sorry, west. I always get those two mixed up. I'm sorry. West Campus. West Campus. So the underpass underneath the railroad tracks is what I meant. And then walk straight through the middle of the apartments. The apartments form little boxes around a courtyard, so you walk straight through the apartment and you'll see a road in front of you, and just in front of you a lovely mansion emerge. So that's where we are. Up the stairs, food, drink, and additional conversation. So thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us, and we hope you'll join us over at